the summer of 1978, my uncle was 16 years of age when my grandparents had sent him to a church camp. When he arrived at the camp, he felt like someone was always watching him. The camp had a very creepy vibe to it. It was a low-budget camp, so everything was either broken or old. He was roommates with a kid named James, who was the same age as him. The first night, my uncle could not sleep. He made a dumb decision and decided to go for a walk. He had a small flashlight that was given to him if he needed to use the bathroom at night. My uncle decided to go out on a walk. When he got on the trail, he heard something falling behind him. My uncle brushed it off as an animal, so he kept walking. He heard the noises keep getting louder and closer to him. This time, he turned around and flashed his flashlight, but he saw nothing on the trail. My uncle, on high alert, started walking faster when he heard the sound of someone running behind him. It was James. He said as soon as my uncle left, he looked out the window of the cabin and saw the figure of a man sneaking around behind him before he entered the trail. My uncle and his friend James started running up the trails when a man yelled at them and started chasing after them. My uncle and his friend James ran into another trail to try and circle around to head back to the direction of the cabins. While my uncle was running, he dropped his flashlight, so they were running in the dark where their only light was the moon. The man was chasing after them. The man tried to shoot at them, but he missed. The sounds of the bullets woke up the whole camp. When they ran back to the camp called the police. This is a forest, so it took a while for the police to get to the camp. When they arrived, they searched the woods, and the man was never found. What they did find, a mile away from the camp, was a black bag with rope, tape, and a knife. If James did not look out the window, that would have been the last time my uncle would have been seen. To this day, my uncle and James still have a friendship, and he is considered a close family friend. I was next. I know this now, and the thought haunts me as I praise some supreme deity for my existence. Not that I believe in God, but I do know that something is out there. Something happens after death that we cannot yet identify, and I wonder how sinister the afterlife really is. I worked a regular 9-to-5 job in western Colorado. I sat at a desk, entered in spreadsheet data for 8 hours, and then left to go home to my empty apartment. The cycle repeated itself 5 days a week: wake up, get dressed, sit at a cubicle, mindlessly entering numbers, go home, sleep, start again. My mind was numbered. I had no family close by, no girlfriend, no pets to keep me company, just a lonely studio with sparse furnishings. It almost made me want to stay at work where I was around other human souls, even if they were also robotically staring at their computers. But the reason for my existence was the drive to and from my workplace. It seemed simple, but the forest I drove through for exactly 5.2 miles was beautiful. Pines lined the curved road as well as delicate but desirably shrubbery. I was often the only car on the road, and although forlorn, it brought with it such a sense of peace that I almost would forget that I was to be working in about 10 minutes or going home to an abandoned apartment. I don't mean to wax poetic, but I would admire the beauty of nature for what it is. Simple, untainted, and so serene. You see, I don't believe I'm allowed happiness in my life, and that's why I think the forest turned against me. It recognized that I had fallen in love, and it proceeded to rip out my heart. That's what life does to you. After all, it decides to kill you emotionally before claiming your body for its own despicable purposes. Contentment even becomes unattainable. Joy can be found lying discarded in a dumpster. It was a normal drive home from work. I rested exhausted in the driver's seat, trying to calm my rapid breath by rolling down my windows and smelling the pines and fresh mountain air. The sky was already dark, and I had my heater cranked up to combat the freezing wind. Overall, it was standard, just the usual drive. Why did it have to change? At the end of the 5.2-mile stretch, there was a stoplight signifying the end of the road in civilization. But that time, as I stared at my odometer, I found myself begin to wonder as the 5.2 slowly turned into 5.3. My head felt foggy. I had yet to reach the stoplight. Perhaps I had forgotten to reset my odometer, or maybe I had simply missed the light. There were both possibilities, but part of my heart began to sink as the odometer crept up like a silent predator. 5.4, 5.6, 6.0. At 7.6, I began to worry. If I had been tired enough to miss something, then I would either have to find a place to turn around or keep driving until I hit 10.4 miles. The latter would have to be the plan I would go with. I had never once missed that stoplight, but I suppose my odometer could have malfunctioned and did not reset. So I enjoyed the fresh air and the trees, beautiful locks of green, and continued driving. That is, until I hit 10.5. Now I knew something was wrong. Could I have really missed that stoplight? The woods around me did not look familiar, and I knew every nook and cranny that nuzzled their way into that forest floor. I told myself that maybe, for some reason, they tore down that stoplight while I was at work. That would be the only way I would have missed my turn. So I flipped my car around, paying close attention for oncoming traffic, and began to drive back. I don't know exactly what I was looking for, maybe some semblance of familiarity. A boulder covered in moss, a tree scorched by an ancient fire. Even my workplace would have sufficed. But as my odometer read 20.8, I began to panic. I had turned around, but I had not reached my work yet. I should have seen that familiar, prison-like structure. I should have seen the glowing McDonald's light that sat next to it. But instead I found myself continuously driving down a dark, unknown stretch of road with only the moon to cast light on the situation. Now, I have never been drunk, never been under the influence of any sort of drug, never been so completely and utterly lost. My heart started pounding by that point. The pines cast sinister shadows across the black road, and I began to realize that I did not hear the sounds normally associated with the forest at night. No owls were hooting. There was not a single deer's eye illuminated by my headlights, and even though I was used to the loneliness of the road, I began conscious of the fact that I had not yet seen another driver, even though I kept my eyes out for one, just in case I could stop them and ask for directions. But there was no sign of life whatsoever, and the crushing isolation began to give me a physical headache. At 30.5 miles, my gas gauge was running low. There was no place to turn, no stoplight, no buildings, and my car was almost empty. My breath came out in short, panicked whimpers. A dark energy seemed to engulf my car, and it suffocated me. It told me as it gripped my throat that once my gauge hit E, then hell would be unleashed. I felt as though my car was guzzling gas on purpose. So much for an eco-friendly vehicle. My car finally and jarringly came to a standstill after empty flashed a few times on my dashboard. The forest surrounded me on both sides like a pack of lions. The trees had jaws and crunched down on my courage. I sat in my car for what felt like an eternity, watching as the moon barely moved across the blackened sky. The stars did not even shine, even though they were normally out in droves like little. White ants flickered across a dark backdrop. My body trembled in the icy wind. At that point, I had two options: wait for rescue or save myself. Freezing to death in my arms of my dead car filled my stomach with dread, so I chose to open the door and step out into the forest. I am not quite sure what I intended to find. I began wandering on the side of the road like a roaming vagabond. Considering those movies I would watch where hitchhikers turned up dead or missing, I kept my thumb tucked in my hand to prevent any temptation. Not that anyone would have come to my aid, the road was deserted. That is, I thought it was. I began hearing rustling in the foliage to my left, and my tracks ceased like a mouse caught in a trap. "Hello?" I called out, not expecting any sort of reply that could be why my skin chilled when I heard one. "Hello." It sounded like a female calling back to me some distance away. My option weighed again: find the person who had yelled to me, or continue marching down the deserted road. I had never been that great at interacting with people, but the thought of not being alone in this terrible nightmare held some sort of appeal. Even though I had sort of crippling anxiety around women, her voice sounded desperate and kind, and I decided to step into the frost-bitten forest. My footsteps echoed eerily through the desolate space. Had it gone darker once the trees had swallowed my form? I couldn't even see my shadow. That's when it surprised me when a form crossed in front of me. "Hello?" I called out again. The figure had just been fleeting, just a brief flash across my vision. But it was a human. There was no mistaking that. "Hello? Is that you?" I received an answer in the reply of a blood-curdling scream from somewhere ahead of me. It was a banshee, a shriek unlike anything I had heard before, and I found myself running forward towards the sound, now worried that the person I was trying to find was desperately injured. My journey led me to the edge of a dangerous cliff. Confused, I doubled back a bit, now completely lost within fronds of foliage. A few times, the screams resonated through the forest, and I went running towards them only to find myself in an empty clearing, or at the edge of another cliff. A few times a figure fleeted in front of me, and I called out to it, only to be met with silence. My path had vanished. No longer could I see the moon from the thickness of the tree's leaves, and I had no way of telling where the road was. I had made a mistake, I realized. I should have not strayed from the highway, and yet there I stood, alone with the figures and screams in the forest. I rested against a tree, but as soon as my palm brushed against its cold flesh, I had a terrifying feeling that there was someone watching. And from what I could tell through my labored breathing, the sensation was coming from above me. Now, I am not a brave man, but something sinister caused me to look up. I let out a string of curses and shrieked as a hanged girl dangled over my head. I found myself on my bottom, staring at her with wide, uncomprehending eyes. Had this girl been the girl that called out to me? What had made her hang herself in just a matter of minutes, or hours? But I realized that was preposterous. Her skin had already begun to peel back from her face, exposing bone, and insects crawled in and out of sockets. The smell permeated from her was unbelievable, and I dry heaved a few times before standing back up and hightailing it out of there. But I was still lost. The scream still persisted, and I still saw the figures. One of the silhouettes paused just long enough for me to get a good look at it, and I realized it was a horribly decayed male teenager. He did nothing but stare at me with empty sockets before dashing off into the night. The other figures began to materialize and solidify more and more as I moved through the forest. Heart pounding, headlight and airy, they were all rotting, and I realized they had various forms of what was possibly their death. Some had ropes still around their necks, some had round, open wounds which spilled their brains, some had no physical wounds, but I figured I didn't want to know what caused their deaths. Why was I seeing such creatures? Why were the screams becoming louder, more feral, and contained different voices? I held my head in my hands, pressing firmly against my temples. I didn't believe in ghosts or demons, and yet they came towards me with curious, through empty eyes and reached for me until I dashed off, only to find myself in another throng of the ghosts. My cheeks felt wet and icy from where I was crying. I tripped a few times into the prickly vegetation, and I felt blood running down my arms and hands. There was a sharp shooting pain in my left hand from where I caught myself when I fell, and upon my inspection and seeing glistening bone, I knew it was severely broken. I sat down where I was and closed my eyes, feeling the darkness swallow me. None of this is real. None of this is real. None of this is real. Ghosts don't exist. And then I felt a presence of yet another creature behind me. And, with tears streaming down my cheeks, I turned to look. It was a female, who still appeared relatively intact. She had bright eyes that hadn't been plucked out by birds or fed on by insects, and her raven hair cascaded down her shoulders delicately. She was wearing tattered clothes that appeared rather old and weathered, but she just looked grimly rather than decayed. Thinking she might be a real person, I stood up to approach her. Screams pierced through my ears, and I was knocked back to the ground by the force of the familiar shrieks. They were the ones I had heard at the beginning of my horrible voyage. Her voice was the one who had called me into the woods in the first place. She started for me, and I begged as she glided quickly along the ground. "No, please," I whimpered. But she reached me all the same. Instead of harming me in any way, she merely passed through me. My body froze. I could see my skin turn blue. An intense wave of emotion that dragged my whole body down in a spirit washed over me, and I curled up on the ground with an intense anxiety attack gripping my breath. My heart began to race. I gasped for breath like a fish pulled from its habitat. The figure had disappeared. The forest was silent once more, but I began to sob to fill the intense void. I was worthless. I had a mediocre job that would never change the world. Where were my dreams of helping others? Where had those gone? I had no family, no friends. I was all alone in the world. And when I died, I would turn to dust. My memories forgotten forever. The thoughts caused panic to seize my body. I felt like running. I felt like hurling at myself at the nearest tree and pummeling it. I felt a physical pain grip my stomach. I wanted to cut it out to ease the pain. Instead, I remained frozen to the ground, unable to move at all other than having my body racked with heartfelt, racking sobs. I stayed this way for what may have been days. It could have easily been weeks. Ethereal shadows flocked around me, and I screamed and held my head, willing for the torment to stop. Thankfully, it did, even though it wasn't at the same time. Actually, my problems were far from having resolved. I did not notice that the sun had rose due to the thickness of the foliage, but I suppose my boss called me in missing when I was inexcusably absent for 3 days in a row from work. The police found me just a few feet from the highway, huddled in a puddle of mud, frostbitten down to my toes. They immediately rushed me to the hospital, where they amputated 3 of my toes and a few of my fingers from my right hand. They took my whole left hand. They even took one of my ears. Once I suppose I was defrosted, they sent me to a mental institution where I kept bawling and speaking of the ghost from the forest, that they had done this to me. I suppose the final straw was when I tried to kill myself with a plastic fork they gave me for lunch one day. At the mental hospital, they diagnosed me with maniac depression and loaded me up on pills. But there was only so much they could do. The group therapy was fine. My fellow prisoners were actually unbelievably nice, as was the staff. But the meds could only ease the growing anxiety and fear that dwelled within me. I was released from the hospital after 3 weeks of incarceration. Upon returning to my apartment, I immediately went to my computer and awkwardly typed in the name of the forest. What I found was not surprising, but it still made me popped too many eggs and acts, which slipped me into a deep coma for a few days, and ended me back up in the hospital. There had been at least 9 reported suicides in the forest. Most went unexplained, but it seemed as though people flocked there to end their lives. Even in the safety of the hospital, taking my pills in hope to combat the growing depression, I knew I was next.